and welcome to CrossTalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. U.S. President Barack Obama has requested $549 billion in military spending for this year, a small decrease over last year. Nonetheless, the global arms business is booming. Do more arms, not less, endanger the world's security? Obviously, events in the Middle East are top of mind. To discuss global military spending, I'm joined by Joel Johnson in Washington. He is from the Teal Group Corporation, an American aerospace and defense consulting company. In Stockholm, we have Paul Holtom. He is a senior researcher with the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute's Arms Transfer Program. And in Oxford, we go to Dipayan Basure. He is a policy advisor for Oxfam. And another member of our CrossTalk team, Yelena Hanga. All right, gentlemen, this is CrossTalk. That means you can jump in anytime you want. I'd like to go very broadly and then go very specific to the Middle East. I'd like to go to Joel first. The United States accounts for 2/3 of all exported arms in the world. Are more arms creating a more stable world or a more destabilized world, or you don't see a direct correlation between the two?
Well, I don't see particularly a direct correlation. I would note, I know one of the common arguments is, gee, sometimes you supply both sides. Well, where we have, such as Greece and Turkey, you haven't had conflict between Greece and Turkey since World War II, which is basically when we started working with both of their militaries. Similarly, in the case of Egypt and Israel, after the '73 war, when Egypt basically changed suppliers from the Soviet Union, qua Russia, to the United States, again, we've had a stabilizing influence, I think, on both sides. It's very hard to find much in the way of at least U.S. arms used against anybody over the last 30 years, which is 40 years, which is a pretty good record. I like to say U.S. weapons work best when they're not used. The whole purpose of selling weapons to a large degree is so that a country that has them doesn't get attacked by anybody, and one hopes they in turn aren't aggressive. Your comment on, go ahead.
Okay, Paul, I'd like to go to you. And I don't want to jump ahead here, but we might see Egypt switch sides in one form or another. We saw Iran change sides in 1979. So a lot of that can be played out with a lot of military hardware there. But Paul, I'd like to ask you, are more arms creating a more unstable world? And according to Joel, there's no correlation between the two, between the amount of arms in the world and political stability.
Well, there's obviously demand for arms, and it's responding in some cases to insecurities. And what we see in certain parts of the world is increases in arms imports and also efforts to produce weapons by countries in response to sort of perceived threats from other countries that are also receiving weapons. So our concern is with regard to, I suppose, the races, and mentions Turkey and Greece not going to war, but one could say they've spent an awful lot of money on weapons that haven't been used, and could that money have been better spent elsewhere, I suppose one could ask.
Dipayan, if I can go to you in Oxford, how do you settle on this issue here? Because we see spiraling arms races. We heard from Joel, and what I want to talk about mostly in this program in the Middle East, but because the Saudis want the most sophisticated military hardware, it's extremely expensive. The Israelis want even better, and so you just up the ante. Then you have this region that is inherently unstable, and then you throw all of this military hardware into it, and it's instability on steroids then, because as we're doing this program, there's not only is there instability, there is massive change going on, and there's a lot of military on the ground.
That's absolutely true, but I think the main point that we need to remember here is that insecurity isn't just in the form of an armed actor. The UN Human Development Reports have identified a whole different set of factors that contribute to people's insecurity. So the question really is that needs to be asked is whether or not actually expenditure on arms is the best way to tackle people's insecurity. And of course, all countries are responsible for their UN Charter obligations, which says that it should be the least diversion of arms, least diversion of resources towards arms. So it's a question of need. What is the proportionality of your expenditure to this need that you identify as your security threat? And in some cases, arms are not the right response at all.
Joel, if I can go to you, a lot of people would say cynically, I would tend to agree with them too, is that when we look at customers in the Arab world and the greater Middle East, I mean, these are governments, monarchs, dictators that are buying military materiel to protect their regime, not necessarily their people, because we've seen over almost the last month, we've seen governments opt to use or not to use their military against their own people. So a lot of people would say that turns into kind of an end user issue. I could go much further abroad. If we look at the Gaza conflict, white phosphorus, if that was supplied from the outside and if that would be tied to an American company, one thinks of human rights violations and whatnot. I mean, the thing is that we look at these, we look at weapons and countries buy them, but who? What are their purpose? What's their purpose?
As near as one can tell, the Army was seen as a positive liberating force, and in fact, the shots of demonstrators sleeping on tank treads and embracing soldiers tells you something that I think most of the sources of instability in third world countries, including the Middle East, are indeed internal, and indeed these weapon systems don't tend to be used against their own people. What you tend to see are rubber bullets and tear gas, which is not the kind of thing I think any of us are talking about today. If you look at the reason these countries, I mean, there is some instability, but it's intriguing if you look at the reason some of these countries are purchasing what they're purchasing, whether it be in the Middle East, where there's uncertainty about where Iran is going, related heavily to internal programs of developing intercontinental missiles and nuclear. If you look in Southeast Asia, it's a concern as to what China's intentions are with a Blue Water Navy and demands on the Yellow Sea, and North Korea. I mean, these are where the markets tend to be, is Southeast Asia, East Asia, and the Middle East. In each case, there is a country that unnerves the neighborhood. And on the contrary, you've seen very little in the way of major weapons purchases in Latin America, where by and large, none of the neighbors are terribly concerned about any of the other neighbors.
Okay.
There's some purchases just go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, Paul, I mean, it was brought up here, I guess, Iran indirectly. I mean, if you didn't have countries like Saudi Arabia that were buying state-of-the-art, and I mean in huge amounts, dollar amounts, in some of the other smaller neighbors to Saudi Arabia, then that is why Iran wants to build up its military. I mean, it's doing it for at least defensive purposes. I mean, if someone's militarizing your border, your neighborhood, you don't have much option but to react. And I'm not justifying or agreeing with the Iranians here, but just on a principle basis, if someone's arming your border, you have to react.
Well, I mean, one could raise that as a proportionality aspect, and is what is being supplied, and discussions on more than $60 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia, is that sort of legitimate? I mean, but the other points, I suppose, that come out, one thing to pick up with Joel is that in Latin America we do see concerns with a build-up and arms racing there, so I wouldn't leave those out of the equation. But to come back to the Middle East, I suppose the points that we'd want to address there would be with regard to, I suppose, are these conventional weapons being supplied as a fop to Saudi Arabia and other countries to persuade them not also to go the nuclear route? So we've seen Iran going, and one of the responses could be, I suppose, for them also to consider sort of taking the nuclear option. And I suppose the US could justify its position in terms of, well, we're providing this conventional armory as a sort of a fop, as a means to sort of say, okay, we're going to more than guarantee your security in conventional terms, please don't go the nuclear route. So one could perhaps see that dimension there. But certainly, you would raise the question of the amount of weapons being supplied to the Gulf Cooperation Council states, not just Saudi Arabia, but we've noted the United Arab Emirates as a major importer in recent years too, and others also talking about increasing their systems, both for defence with regard to air defence systems and with combat aircraft that have long-range strike capabilities. So I suppose, you would be worried if you were in Iran surrounded in that neighbourhood too.
Devine, if I could go to you in Oxford, I gave the example earlier in 1979 when the Shah was overthrown in Iran. It left an enormous amount of American military material behind. And, God forbid we see, so much instability that we see the military being used, that sold weapons to the Middle East over the last 30 years. But that does kind of make you think that if one country can fall that has enormous arsenals, it can be used for other purposes. We've seen this in Iran. I mean, it could happen again, considering the instability that we see today.
Absolutely. I mean, there's certainly issues around stockpile security and management issues, which will continue to creep up as arsenals continue to grow out of hand, which again comes back to that question of need. How do you actually identify what is the need that a country is necessarily responding to in terms of its arms procurement? The more amount of money that is diverted away from social expenditure, such as health and education, the less we're talking about building up the developmental gains, building up the kind of environment where people have the ability to live productive and dignified lives. And when those processes are hindered and when money is essentially diverted away from these kinds of processes, that's when you start seeing popular unrest. And that's when these kinds of issues start to come back and really push at that nub of what defines need. And I think Paul raises a good point about proportionality. When you identify a threat, to what degree do you identify a sort of a resource envelope to deal with that particular threat, rather than just having a wish list of the flashiest kit that's available nowadays?
Joel, if I can go to you, I mean, we've been talking about countries in the Middle East and their governments and their militaries, but I mean, American corporations make a killing on this, don't they? I mean, the world recession passed them by without any kind of problem at all. Business is great. I mean, it's a very lucrative business, isn't it? And they want to keep pushing it.
Let me make a couple comments. First, on your chronology, I think it's worth noting that the notion that Iran somehow feels threatened by Saudi Arabia is a bit extreme. I mean, the GCC states and Saudi haven't fought anybody for 50 years. The wars have been Iran-Iraq, where they fought a war and tens of thousands of people died, and Iran then moved toward creating both missiles and nukes. I mean, if you're Saudi Arabia sitting there and you've got wealth and oil and you're looking at a theocratic dictatorship to the north of you, you get a little bit nervous about life.
Okay, Joel, I'm going to jump in here. I'm going to jump in here right now, and I want to continue with this idea when we get back after a short break. We'll continue our discussion on arms spending around the world. Stay with RT.
Wealthy British scion Zach Goldsmith, investment activist
Markets, finance, scandal. Find out what's really happening to the global economy in Kaiser Report on RT.
Download the official RT application to your iPhone or iPod Touch from the iTunes App Store. Watch RT live on the go. Video on demand, RT's live broadcasts, and RSS feeds now in the palm of your hand. Question more on RT.com.
Welcome back to CrossTalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're speaking about military budgets in the greater Middle East. But first, let's see what Russians think about their country's defense spending.
It all comes down to weapons. Due to global economic crisis, many countries cut defense budgets. In the United States, the world's largest weapons producer and seller, President Obama is trying to cut defense spending. The Russian Public Opinion Research Center asked Russians if the government should provide more money to maintain a strong military force. 71% think the amount of money should be increased. 17% say it should remain at current levels. And only 3% believe government spending can be reduced. For many, a large defense budget means safety in today's world. Peter?
Okay, I'd like to maybe we'll go back to the Iran issue in a second, but I'd like to talk about just how transparent arms transfers are in the Middle East, and I'd like to go to Paul on that. I mean, from small arms all the way up to the big ticket items, is there enough transparency for your taste to keep an eye on what's going into the region?
Certainly not from the region itself. I mean, it's one of the few regions that has a very, very poor record with regard to reporting its imports to the UN Register of Conventional Arms, sort of a universal mechanism that all states can report.
Paul, why is it so poor? Paul,
wait,
if I can interrupt, why is it so poor? Why is the record so poor?
Well, they very often point to the fact that they're concerned with the nuclear state, nuclear forces in Israel, and imbalances there, and the lack of transparency on issues other than conventional arms, and that's one of the reasons it's given. But I think it's also to do with regard to the fact that we're talking about big deals in the region and concerns with corruption, corrupt business practices also being there. And so there's an opacity, I think, in general with regard to security issues for a range of reasons, from the security all the way across to sort of the corrupt practices.
Deepayan in Oxford, I mean, what about the transparency issue there? Because if you don't know what your neighbor is doing, then that creates more insecurity. I mean, this is a vicious circle around and around and around.
Absolutely. And this is one of the main reasons why Oxfam is part of a large coalition working towards lobbying governments to deliver a very strong arms trade treaty. And one of the key elements of the arms trade treaty is this question of transparency, because frankly, at the moment, no country is compelled to report any of their dealings. The UN register happens to be a voluntary mechanism, and there are no global architecture that compels countries or obligates countries to respond to and provide open and transparent information about their procurement and indeed their exports and their shipments of arms. And this hopefully will be one of the benchmarks of the arms trade treaty, which will ensure that countries have an idea that there's a certain set of rules and responsibilities that they all must adhere to. And actually that comes back to your question, because if everybody knows what everybody has, then that certainly reduces the myth of the sort of insecurity that gets perpetuated by lack of information.
Would this new treaty involve also private companies that export weapons systems to countries and not just governments?
Well, at the end of the day, most companies that are actually exporting, if they're doing it by the law, it has to go through the governments. The governments of the producers have to provide an export license, and as such are compelled to report that information.
Joel, how would the industry feel about that, at least in the United States, about having this kind of global treaty that would keep track of arms transfers? Is that something the companies that build all these nice shiny weapons for hopefully no use in the greater Middle East? How do they feel about it?
Well, we wouldn't have any problem because we are transparent. I mean, I've used recently both SIPRI data and the UN registry, and of course the U.S. reports to both and provides all the information you'd want. The State Department publishes data, Defense Department publishes data, Customs Department publishes data. You just commented about the package to Saudi. I mean, Congress is notified of every major purchase that's put in the Federal Register. Congress reviews it. So, I mean, there is no secret about what we provide to anybody, with a couple of exceptions, probably actually dealing with the UK and on nuclear stuff. But in terms of the countries you're interested in, what we do is highly public, and of course no company does anything without, as was just pointed out, a license from the State Department or a sale through the Defense Department, who in turn makes the sale off to the foreign government. So we don't have any problem at all.
Joel, I guess I kind of missed something in this conversation. I would go back to Paul. Are you satisfied with that answer? Because you said there's lack of transparency, and Joel saying there's complete transparency. What's the difference between the two?
Well, the clarification would be that, I mean, Joel's correct in terms of what happens traditionally is there's a lot more transparency on the side of exporters letting you know what they do. And in some countries there are sort of requirements in law to report upon arms transfers, and you have that in the European Union, you have that in the US, and to some degree in Canada, South Africa. It's not perfect, but it's certainly better than what you get on the recipient side, on the importer side. So in terms of we see what's going into the Middle East from what's reported by exporters, it's not a full picture, but it's a pretty good picture and much better than what you get in terms of what they're doing in the region. The problem, of course, becomes, the fact that not all states are that transparent. Russia, for example, doesn't provide beyond the UN Register submission information on what it's doing with states in the region. So, there is an imbalance between different countries around the world, and you can, as was mentioned before, use that to create misperceptions, threats. But at the same time, some of the counter-arguments that might be given would be, well, if I know what they have, then I'll actually be inclined to buy more, to throw a sort of devil's advocate role here. The argument against sort of greater transparency in these regards is also that it can feed into arms races also.
Then how do we end the arms race in the middle? How do we end the arms race in the Middle East? It seems like we have no answers here at all, even if we have this treaty. Dipayan, what do you think about that? I mean, how can you start progressively demilitarizing this very militarized region, or we're just going to have to live with it?
Well, that's not necessarily the
I think part you're going to have to live with, but I would just point out, I think I was going to say the Saudi and the GCC states, to me, in part, are somewhat comparable to a Singapore or Switzerland. They're small populations. They want people to know they have weapon systems. They basically want to be left alone, and as is the case with the Swiss or the Singaporeans, who are small populations and have historically wanted to be left alone and bought weapons accordingly, but have never been aggressive with anybody in the neighborhood. But they do look with some askance at the people they have in their neighborhood. If you're going to wind down some things, I mean, let's get some transparency, for example, in terms of Iran and its nuclear program, or its indigenous development of missiles.
And I always find that, Iran's nuclear program, the IAEA says it doesn't have any evidence of it, but it gives every single country in the region, if they're an American ally, this is the boogeyman, okay? And so if they do have a nuclear weapon and developed it, then what difference is all of this military going to have against it? It doesn't seem to make much sense to me. Dipayan, if I can go to you in Oxford, I mean, is this using it as an excuse for militaries to have nice, shiny planes and things like that?
Well, I mean, again, it keeps coming back to that same question, which is essentially need. I mean, as I've said, the lack of transparency has created a complete era of mistrust, where there is no confidence-building measures that can actually proactively be taken amongst the countries in the region, and that continues to perpetuate this need that we need more, we need bigger, we need shinier, we need more powerful. But at the same time, there are, of course, major constraints to this. A lot of this procurement is actually coming off the back of a fairly small resource envelope in some cases. And those questions need to be asked. Where is this money coming from? What is the impact of this procurement on the rest of the government's ability to do its job? We're asking about questions such as debt, because, of course, all of this shiny kit can't just be purchased, with the change in your pocket. If you've got the relevant cash reserves, that then depletes the power of your currency. If you buy it on credit, that then creates massive public debt that the country will then have to pay back for many, many, many years. So the question isn't necessarily about arming and militarizing, but it's about what that procurement is actually attempting to address. What's the problem, and are arms necessarily the response to that problem?
What do you think about that, Paul? I mean, there are limited resources there, so in your great attempt to secure yourself to make you safe, you can actually seriously damage your economy, and that military will be of no value to you whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, indeed, the question of the resources comes up again and again. But I suppose there's also the fact that with some of the transfers to the Middle East from the US in particular, they're paid for by military aid, with Israel and Egypt receiving considerable sums from the US each year in terms of financial assistance that's used to spend on weapons. So the US is also, in a sense, sort of helping with the procurement there, and in a sense, I guess, alleviating the burden, but also, causing some of the concerns for the region that are raised. I suppose also with regard to the Gulf Cooperation Council states and doing nothing, I guess I would point to the fact that Saudi Arabia does have some incursions into Yemen and is using its shiny kit purchased from the US and other states. So I'm not sure about the benignness, although one can, of course, discuss the Houthi problem there. But to say that they're not using it at all, I think it would be a question there. But to come back to Dipayan's point, the issue of confidence-building measures, I mean, one can look to, for example, what happened in Europe with the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, the Conventional Forces Europe agreements, the exchanges that happened there, even though the conditions were not perhaps different, but we have in the coming years the conference on the Middle East, and perhaps conventional arms could also be put onto that agenda. And one of the things that could be looked at in that context is not just the nuclear dimension, but also perhaps this particular aspect. And to do that, I think we'd have to start work now in terms of finding people that are willing to discuss this issue.
Joel, I'm going to give you the last word. Do you ever worry about defense companies in the United States that might, they made so much money off of this market that those weapons, as we just heard of Saudi Arabia and Yemen, might actually be used and its destructive force will really be seen because we have a region that is really armed to the teeth?
Well, again, all I can do is look at history, and by and large, the people that have U.S. weapons have not been aggressors in these various.
Minus Israel. Minus Israel, right?
Israel's always a bit of an exception, and I'm not going to get into that one because that has a lot more to do with domestic politics than it does anything else. And secondly, I am sympathetic that particularly countries with low per capita income shouldn't be spending a lot of money on weapons. In general, that's the case, not everywhere.
Okay, Joe, I'm going to have to jump in here. We've run out of time here. Many thanks to my guests today in Washington, Stockholm, and in Oxford. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here on RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules.